we're going to look at the history and the future of the mall, the visionary ideas and modern challenges. This is the mall that we all know, a place of museums, of monuments where history takes place every day. It is our Athenian Acropolis, our Roman Forum. It's our American Acropolis that symbolizes who we are and our values and our ongoing history. Challenges include security and restricted access, the closing of Pennsylvania Avenue, blocking of the western front of the Capitol with views of the mall, increasing restrictions on public access to our spaces. This is the view we no longer can see because the west front of the Capitol is off limits to the public. Restricted public access, the book festival, the National Book Festival used to be on the mall, but the Park Service denied permits in 2014. It's since moved to the Convention Center. And of course, we've got overbuilding of memorials. In 1980, we had the major monuments, the Capitol, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln, the White House, and the Jefferson Memorial. But starting in 1982, there was a proliferation of new memorials, the Vietnam vets in 1982, Korean vets in 95, the FDR Memorial in 97, the World War II Memorial in 2004. And because of the huge national controversy about the siting and the design of this monument, in 2003, Congress passed legislation declaring the mall a substantially completed work of civic art with a moratorium on future building. However, they've been making exceptions ever since, for the Martin Luther King in 2011, the Eisenhower Memorial in 2020. Now under construction is the National Desert Storm and Desert Shield Memorial over by the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And we have 4 future memorials that Congress have authorized for the National Mall: the Global War on Terror, Fallen Journalists, National Medal of Honor, and Women's Suffrage. We also have overbuilding of museums. In 2004, the American Indian Museum opened and was declared the last museum site on the mall. But of course, it wasn't, because in 2016, the African American Museum was inaugurated, and it was called the last museum on the site on the mall. However, Congress has authorized 2 future Smithsonian museums, Women's History and American Latino, for a location on the mall. Flooding is one of the more existential threats we have. On December 31st of 2023, the Washington Post had a front page story with 5 pages inside showing diagrams of the creeks, the rivers, the streams that have caused Washington to regularly flood. It points out the nation's capital was built on top of fill, covering a series of streams. They are coming back to life. They have really useful illustrations that show, for instance, the Lincoln Memorial is located in the Potomac River. The Washington Monument was originally close to the edge of the Potomac. And they start the article by pointing out that when the African American History and Culture Museum was built in the early 2000s, they immediately discovered buried Tiber Creek. We knew Tiber Creek was down there, but it turns out it was much more prolific in scope, and they had to do major adjustments with long delays in order to flood-proof the basement of the building. One of the most destructive storms was in 2006, when Constitution Avenue and the mall were underwater during a heavy rainstorm. This had nothing to do with the Potomac River. It was simply heavy rain flowing down to a low spot. And of course, it's a regular event. The New York Times identified in the front page in 2019 what the problem is. This is that the sewers are no match for powerful storms, and the water backs up and floods. The greatest challenge we have identified is who's in charge. Essentially, everybody and nobody. The architect of the Capitol has jurisdiction over all the buildings to the east, the Capitol, the Library of Congress, Supreme Court, and the House and Senate office buildings. The Park Service has jurisdiction over the open grass and trees, as well as the major monument. The Smithsonian over its museums and gardens. The National Gallery over 2 museums and a sculpture garden, and the GSA over the public buildings surrounding the mall space. It's even worse when you look at oversight. There are 14 committees in Congress that have oversight over different aspects of the mall, some of them over the agencies, some of them over things like memorials, some over things like security. And you have, on the left half of this, DC committees, review commissions, and in the lower left, of federal review commissions through which approval must be sought, making it a very complicated process to get projects through. And so that was one reason we decided to create the National Mall Coalition. We saw that the World War II Memorial was imposing a monument on an existing monument, that is the reflecting pool of the Lincoln Memorial. And there was a national outrage on people on left and right, members of Congress, and we realized that there was really no one speaking for the public interest. They were mostly speaking for different agencies. And so we created the National Mall Coalition. This was the reflecting pool before the World War II Memorial. And of course, now we have enclosed it with the World War II Memorial, which changed not only the symbolism, but also the way in which people can pass through this space. We found that there was no mall map. And so we created in 2005 our National Mall map and historical guide. It's a very small pocket map. We've distributed over 1 million of them at Dulles National Airport, as well as at many hotels and at Union Station. It is the only mall map. The Park Service has maps of parks throughout Washington, including memorial parks, and the Smithsonian has maps showing the museums, but then their maps end at the Washington Monument because there are no museums to the west of the Washington Monument. So we wanted to do a map that was not about facilities and ownership and management, but it was about the inherent plan and meaning of the National Mall since its establishment in 1791. We also have come up with an idea we call the third century mall, that the first century mall, the original mall, was expanded in the 19th century and 10th in the 20th century, and we believe it can expand again to allow the story told and the public activities to continue to grow. And we've come up with an idea for a flood water storage concept, the National Mall Underground, that I'll return to at the end of this presentation. We have to look at the visionary planning legacy to understand what we have, what's being lost, what's being challenged, and to think about the future. When we look from the air at the mall, we can see the Capitol, the Washington Monument, and the Lincoln Memorial are all aligned. This represents the east-west axis of the National Mall, and it's intersected by the north-south axis, which goes from the White House to the Washington Monument to the Jefferson Memorial. Two avenues, Pennsylvania Avenue and Maryland Avenue, connect the Capitol building to the White House and to the Jefferson Memorial and Tidal Basin. This geometry and symbolism is all rooted in the two historic plans that have given us the mall we know today, the 1791 L'Enfant Plan and the 1901-2 Macmillan Commission Plan. The original planning vision for Washington comes from 1791. The Congress gave George Washington the opportunity to locate the new capital city for the new United States in 1790 with the Residence Act. He chose the site at the confluence of the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. And he asked Peter Charles L'Enfant, Pierre L'Enfant signed his letters Peter, so we call him Peter, asked Peter L'Enfant, an engineer who had fought with him during the Revolution, to design the new nation's capital. L'Enfant worked closely with Thomas Jefferson as well. In coming up with a plan, he was thinking big. The plan should be drawn on such a scale as to leave room for the aggrandizement and embellishment which the increase of the wealth of the nation will permit it to pursue at any period, however remote. He was thinking like a European. He had grown up in Paris. He was thinking long-term, not simply the seat of government. He and George Washington mounted horses and rode along the rolling hills here at the confluence of the Potomac and the Anacostia to think about how to lay out the city. And he found at the site, the highest spot in the center of the city, a pedestal awaiting a monument. And it was there that he placed the most important building in the United States, the Capitol building, seat of representational government. And of course, in Europe, that would have been a castle or a palace or a cathedral of some kind. That became the centerpiece of the geometry of the layout of the entire city. The Capitol is the center of the north-south axis and of the east-west axis, which divides the city into its four quadrants: northwest, northeast, southeast, and southwest. North Capitol Street goes directly north, south Capitol south, East Capitol to the east, and to the west is the National Mall. A mile away on another rise, he located the White House, the second most important building, the seat of the president. And where an axis south of the White House intersected an axis west of the Capitol building, he located a monument to George Washington, both the general and now the president. Between all of these symbols of American founding principles, he put a grand avenue, a public walks, and a place of general resort. That's what we know as the mall. It was intended to be the public center piece of the city as well as the nation. And Tiber Creek, which ran just north of the mall, he put into what he called the Washington Canal. Notice the Potomac shoreline at the time was directly west of the Washington Monument, west and south. So the Washington Monument at the time constituted the end of the capital city to the west. And then he connected the main symbolic places of Washington, the monuments to America, with avenues named for the original colonies. Pennsylvania Avenue, the most important state because of the Declaration of Independence and constitutional conventions, was the avenue connecting the Capitol building to the White House. But all throughout the city, he put diagonal avenues named for the states that intersected monuments throughout the city and also overlaid the grid, the orthogonal grid of the housing spaces, the residential areas. In fact, he had laid out the city as a geographic embodiment of the Constitution. We the people at the center, the elected leadership, the balance of federal and state authority. And then the question was, in what style shall we build? Certainly, we didn't want to look to England. We wanted to look to some symbolic architecture for the new nation. And in fact, George Washington authorized a competition in 1792, the first of what have become many, many, many public competitions for major monuments in the capital city. And he advertised far and wide for someone. He put out the specifications, what we needed, a lobby, a Senate room, a conference room, and the entries came in. But George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, both reviewing them, were very disappointed at what they saw. James Diamond's building, you see here on the left, was essentially a long horizontal with columns attached at the lower level, a dome with a giant eagle attached to the top. Charles Wintersmith came up with a great open space for the meeting of the House and the Senate with a dome-like, also an arena kind of like dome over it. But when George Washington saw William Thornton, 1793 design, he knew that this is what he wanted. He and Thomas Jefferson both agreed that this long horizontal building with at its center a temple with a domed rotunda above it was appropriate. What were they thinking of? Well, they were thinking of the ancient Roman Republic, the Pantheon in Rome with its temple front and a domed rotunda behind, a building that already Thomas Jefferson had shown great preference for, not only for its beautiful form, but also for its symbolism. Here was the new American Republic making architectural reference back to the ancient Roman Republic. And so when we look at the Capitol today, we're looking at what remains of the original design, but now, of course, the dome we're looking at was the higher dome raised in the middle of the 19th century when the Capitol building was extended as the nation was growing. Classical tradition, the ancient Roman and Greek tradition, then became the model for Washington's official architecture, including the Lincoln above and the Supreme Court below left. So that was the vision. What was the reality? Well, by the 1840s, Washington was still a little village. Very few people lived there. Congress would only come in for weeks at a time and then go home to their states. You can see that the Capitol building had been put in place on the pedestal awaiting a monument, but to the right of it, the area of the mall we can see is still farmland. By the 1860s, the city had grown exponentially because of its role during the Civil War. One building was finalized, the Smithsonian Castle you see in the distance, but the Washington Canal had turned into a fetid sewer. You can see it here. It would go stagnant. It was used as a dump and a sewer and needed to be cleaned up. By 1900, the Washington Canal had been buried under Constitution Avenue, and the mall itself, far from being L'Enfant's grand avenue, was essentially covered with trees. You had the Smithsonian Castle building and the Arts and Industries building in place, but the rest was tree covered, and Congress had given over part of the public space to the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Company and Railroad Station. And that's a station you're seeing here, a Victorian building right on the mall with a shed over the train to the right, and you can see puffs of smoke as the trains pass in front of the Capitol building. It was clear to the American Institute of Architects and some members of Congress that the mall was a mess, and we needed a renewed vision. So in 1901-2, Senator McMillan created the Senate Park Commission, or the McMillan Commission, and actually invited the greatest designers of the day, Chicago architect Daniel Burnham, a landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., New York architect Charles McKim, and sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens to come up with a new plan. The first thing they did was look at L'Enfant's plan. And they traveled to Europe to visit some of the locations that would have inspired L'Enfant, including Versailles. Here we're looking at the gardens of Versailles from a photograph in the Macmillan Commission report up above, and you can see that the way it's celebrated today, which is in the lower right, with fountains, with beautiful vistas across a green sward with walkways and framed by trees, and a great canal in the distance, was very much what L'Enfant was inspired by, and so was the Macmillan Commission. Notice also the images are filled with people, because the idea here was that the design was really for the refreshment and enjoyment of the public. So when we look at their watercolor of the Macmillan Commission plan, we notice something right away. The Washington Monument is no longer at the edge of the city, as it was during L'Enfant's time. Instead, in the 1880s and 90s, the Army Corps of Engineers had been dredging the Potomac River and dumping that soil west and south of the Washington Monument, creating hundreds of acres of landfill. They then used that to extend the mall, extended it 1 mile west of the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial, which they called a memorial erected to the memory of that one man in our history as a nation who is worthy to be named with George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. As Henry Bacon, the designer of the Lincoln Memorial, said, you have at one end of the mall, the establishment of government, in the middle of the mall, the father of the government, and at the west end of the mall, the preserver of that government. So that is the symbolism ultimately that came to play during the World War II controversy as well. And then south of the Washington Monument, they extended the north-south axis to what became the Jefferson Memorial. This is one of their watercolors that they used to convince Congress and the president at the time that this was a vision worth implementing. It was also influenced by the City Beautiful movement of the turn of the 20th century, when cities were trying to get rid of their industrial blight and beautify themselves. And what is it? It's a vision of white classical buildings framing rows of trees and a green sward down the center, very similar in many ways to Versailles. Many pools and fountains were intended to be part of the plan. And what about the Smithsonian Castle? Well, it was red and it was medieval, and so it was going to have to go. What about the DC community? Macmillan Commission didn't really care. What they were trying to create was a great monumental symbolic core, symbol of America at the turn of the 20th century. America had come of age on the international stage. So that was the vision. Here's 1900. One of the biggest impediments to implementing the Macmillan vision was that the railroad ran across the middle of the mall. Daniel Burnham was a genius at inspiring planning ideas, and he convinced the owner that Congress would give him a new location if he were willing to move. And so the old station, which is located where the National Gallery of Art West building now is, was abandoned, and instead a new station was placed north of the Capitol, what we now know as Union Station, with its classical architecture, its triumphal arch architecture at the entry to the train station. And that architectural classicism pervaded development in the first half of the 20th century. You can see the Natural History Museum, the Lincoln Memorial, but you can see that by the 1920s, only the Lincoln Memorial and the reflecting pool had been put in place. The west end of the mall with the Capitol building was still filled with trees and buildings. Here we can see the Lincoln, but also this part of the mall now had to receive World War I temporary buildings as government workers and military moved to Washington during World War I and needed open space. And so the World War I tempos were put in place. And during World War II temporary buildings also were placed so that by the 1960s, and this is how I recall the mall, you had temporary buildings north and south of the reflecting pool, as well as at the foot of the Capitol building. And they were not removed until the 1970s and 80s. Here, when you look at the 1963 mark on Washington from a high view, you can still see those temporary buildings still there. It wasn't until the bicentennial in 1976 and later that those buildings were removed and we got the picture postcard open space that we know today. In the meantime, the mall took on new function. It became the stage for American democracy. This is the metaphor we created for our mall map. Up until the creation of our map in 2005, the Park Service had essentially referred to the mall as a national park. And the Smithsonian had or a collection of memorial parks. And the Smithsonian talked about it as a collection of museums and open space. But for us, we were trying to encapsulate the whole concept that the mall was really staged for our democracy. And happy to say, one of the few successes we have had is that the mall is now referred to both by the Smithsonian and by the Park Service and by the Trust for the Mall as a civic stage. So we changed the concept from a collection of buildings to a public space for the public to play out American history. In the 40s, we already had the cherry blossoms. Of course, it's ongoing. We had the fireworks, but we also had the making of history. For instance, Marian Anderson singing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1939, anti-war demonstrations in the 1960s, and every day, everything from inaugural ceremonies to anti-war protests and commemorative events take place on this open space. Beyond the Macmillan Plan, shifting values we can see in the later 20th century. The view that we have of the mall is essentially based in the Macmillan Plan for the mall. But we can see that by the later 20th century, the shift from the classical tradition towards now two new museums, the American Indian in the upper right and the African American, have shifted from classical to more culturally inspired architectural forms. The American Indian inspired by the rocky cliffs of the Southwest United States, and the African American inspired by a West African metallic crown. We see the same in memorials. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in 1982 turned to a sleek, modernist design of two intersecting black planes. We see also a variety of modern approaches to memorial building with the Martin Luther King Memorial on the left and the World War II Memorial on the right. As the memorials have grown in space, they've also grown in size. I'm going to show you two examples. One is the FDR Memorial. Originally, the FDR Memorial, first proposed in the 1950s, was going to be 14 acres. It was subsequently reduced to 7 acres. But it is very large, and it's essentially four rooms that tell of the four administrations of FDR in a sculptural form, in inscriptions, and in landscape forms. FDR, it's interesting to note, in 1941, had spoken of a memorial. He said, if a memorial is erected to me, I know exactly what it should be. It should be consist of a block about the size of my desk, placed at the center of the green plot in front of the archives. I don't care what it's made of, whether limestone or granite, but I want it plain, without any ornamentation, with a simple carving in memory of. And in fact, in 1965, that memorial was put in place in front of the National Archives building. So what we're looking at is a proliferation of memorials, but also the increased growth in the size and almost museum-like quality of memorials. And the question is, can we continue in this way? The Eisenhower Memorial, which was dedicated only 4 years ago, is the most recent example of the proliferation of ever larger memorials. Here you can see it's located on what was Maryland Avenue with 80-foot high columns. Maryland Avenue has been permanently closed now to allow for this memorial design. The very famous architect, his original concept was the barefoot boy from Abilene, Kansas. Gary's concept was he wanted to elevate the notion that anybody can be president. And so you will see this little statue on a pedestal. The metal tapestries on these 80-foot high columns was to show a landscape of Abilene, Kansas, where Eisenhower was from. The controversy over this memorial included the Eisenhower family objecting to the barefoot boy and to the notion of Kansas, when in fact the president had served such an important role as both the supreme commander of Allied forces during the war and as 34th president. And so the concept was changed as elements were added to it. And that includes the sculptures, which have essentially shifted the original concept from the barefoot boy to now another, essentially a World War II memorial. And the illustration on the tapestry, these metallic sketches, originally to show the landscape in Kansas, were changed to now a sketchy depiction of Pont d'Oc, the place where the D-Day invasions took place. But as you can see here, and I've talked with many members of the public who come to Washington as tourists, it's very hard to see what you're looking at, especially when you're looking up at 80 feet high. In fact, the Eisenhower family had suggested a simple solution. The Eisenhower building is the old executive office building across from the White House. They had that building had been renamed the Eisenhower building. And the Eisenhower family said, let's put a statue of Eisenhower out in front. That would be good enough. So again, on the one concept, you have the simplicity of a statue. On the other hand, you have the proliferation now of architectural forms. One of my personal feelings is we should stop asking architects to build memorials and maybe ask poets and sculptors, those that are more concerned not with building, but with ideas and giving visual form to ideas. So what's the future? Is the mall complete? Well, obviously not. It continues to grow despite what Congress says. And of course, we've got new memorials on their way. Can we make the mall sustainable? So this is what the National Mall Coalition has been proposing for some years now, our third century mall concept. Our website talks about this concept of advancing the legacy of the National Mall through public policy and innovative ideas. We've focused our attention on trying to come up with solutions. The first century mall, of course, was George Washington and L'Enfant. The second century mall were the great designers of the Macmillan Commission. We think we need a third century mall commission of visionary architects, engineers, landscape architects, civic leaders, and the public to come up with a new plan. Here are a few goals we have. Expand the mall boundaries again so we can tell more of the American story. The original first century mall ended at the Washington Monument. The second century mall, the Macmillan Mall, ended a mile west and further south with the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials and hundreds of acres of public land. The third century mall, we can believe, can expand again. It's all federal land. There's no taking of private land on both sides of the Potomac and even on the Anacostia. It would incorporate also existing presidential memorials such as the Kennedy Center, Roosevelt Island, and the LBJ Memorial Grove. It can be done, we believe. It would create new venues for monuments, for memorials, for public gathering places, and we could bring back the solar decathlon on the left, lower left, which used to be on the mall. We could bring back the National Book Festival. We could create spaces up by the Jefferson Memorial. Of course, flooding is an issue, but we could create spaces that could accommodate what we need. goal, prioritize public access and use of the open space. In other words, bring back people. The grass can be made usable, and it can be made sustainable. We do it for soccer, we do it for softball, we do it for football. We should be able to maintain the grass while also keeping public activity alive on the mall, whereas the Park Service has been essentially pushing people off. We need to open access and regain this view that gives us a full expression of the long-form concept, the constitutional concept underlying the layout of our nation's capital. We need to rethink memorials and how we tell our American story and who decides. Do we need acres of monuments in granite? Do we need acres and acres? Do we need more war memorials? These are questions that a commission could ask and answer. Could we think more modestly, like the Albert Einstein Memorial at 2101 Constitution Avenue, a statue sitting on a podium there that is a regular invitation for people, young people and old, to come and engage with a memorial in a way that you can't when you have 80-foot high columns, as at the Eisenhower. Could we think about the long walk of the mall from the Capitol to the Lincoln, which is 2 long miles, and I've walked it with 6th graders. Can we think of a way of animating it, not just with benches, but maybe by adding statues? Walt Whitman, he served in Washington during the Civil War. We could put a statue to Walt Whitman, or Mark Twain, telling American stories, commenting on American life. Could we think of the concept of Statuary Hall? Here's Rosa Parks in the Capitol building in Statuary Hall. Could we think of bringing Statuary Hall out onto the mall, either permanently or temporarily with a rotating exhibit? Bring Clara Barton and other figures who have played important roles in medicine and science, in art and literature and civil rights, down to the long walk along the mall to make it more a basis for civic education. And of course, can we find some way to decide what stories get told on the mall? Right now, you have an idea, you go to Congress. If Congress likes it, then you are given a place. Here's the 24 steps the Park Service has elucidated. First, you go to Congress, tell Congress you want your memorial or your museum. Congress sends you to the National Capital Memorials Commission, which advises whether they think it belongs in Washington or on the mall or not. Then you go back to Congress if they said yes, and you get congressional authorization to be in the city, in the Capitol, or on the mall. Then you start site review. Choosing your location, you go to DCPC, National Capital Planning Commission, the DC Planning Office, the Commission of Fine Arts, and you go back and forth between them trying to find appropriate site. Then you go through design review with the same groups, and you repeat and you repeat. It's a very complicated process involving many different agencies. Could we find a way to make it a more orderly process that, instead of being politically inspired, is more engaged with trying to tell a civic tale that improves civic education in America? Finally, can we make the mall resilient to climate change? There are innumerable studies pointing out, from all the different government agencies as well as universities, pointing out the problem of flooding in Washington. Back already in 2003, there's George Oberlander testifying before the Senate, before the House in 2003 about the African American Museum. Already back in 2003, we were pointing out that the Tiber Creek ran under that site. But it's something we've all known for a long time. The question is, when can we finally do something about it? In 2021, the New York Times had a front page story about saving history at the Smithsonian with sandbags, regular flooding. The article included this map showing in blue the location of Tiber Creek and how the museums were closely associated with it or built directly over it. In June of this past year, the Park Service was given approval by the government agencies to launch its plan to lift portions of the seawalls along the Potomac River and partially into the tidal basin. And in order to understand this bigger issue, we need to look at the 3 threats. And this is a slide presentation put together by the National Capital Planning Commission. The first threat is river flooding. There's the Potomac River flowing down from West Virginia and Maryland and Virginia and inundating the city. We see that often regularly down at Washington Harbor, and that is why the Park Service built its 17th Street levee at Constitution Avenue to stop the Potomac from overflowing and barreling down into downtown Washington. Coastal flooding is another where the tidal surges come up, and this is regularly seen at the tidal basin, where the walkways, the cherry trees, and the museum memorials are often inundated. Here you can see the view. The seawalls are going to be raised only partially into this area. You can see the extent of the Park Service's plan with the arrows, but the rest of the tidal basin is not due to get higher seawalls. And so the question becomes, what happens at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial? This is an issue raised by the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee. As their climate scientists had pointed out, if you put up partial walls, where does the water go? And the evidence seems to point that it could make flooding even worse than it is regularly already. And the third is interior flooding. This has nothing to do with the river. It has only to do with heavy rains pouring down into the city and down to the lowest part of the city, which is Constitution Avenue. That's what we saw in 2006. And that's what we see when the Smithsonian's collections are underwater. So we've got three threats. Can we make the entire mall resilient? The Smithsonian, on the one hand, it says it's going to put cisterns under each of its buildings. The Park Service wants to raise portions of its seawalls. We believe we need a comprehensive solution. To understand the nature of the problem we need to address, we need to understand the topography. Here is 1791, the topography, the Potomac shoreline at the Washington Monument, the Tiber Creek, very wide between the mall and the president's house, put into a canal, the Capitol building and White House on high ground. But 100 years later, the Potomac shoreline had been moved 1 mile west. Both the Lincoln and the Jefferson are essentially sitting in the Potomac River. And this is why it's no surprise that both the landfill is sinking and the water is rising, causing this terribly devastating problem. It's the same thing in the Federal Triangle. It's built over Tiber Creek, and when the heavy rains come, this is the lowest part of the city, the waters flow down, and Tiber Creek rises from below, complicating the flooding problem. As the Washington Post has shown, we have a serious problem, but right now, no urgency. So we came up with a concept, a comprehensive stormwater solution, which we call the National Mall Underground. It's an underground reservoir that, when it's not needed for flood control, can be used for parking garage and geothermal. It could hold tour buses, school buses, as well as cars. It could collect 28 to 30 million gallons of stormwater. That is, in fact, the 200-year flood that happened in 2006. Arthur Cotton Moore, the architect, designed it, working with structural engineers and civil engineers. And they believe that this could be a major place for taking in the water for the entire mall area, not just for individual museums. The upper level would have a mall welcome center for mall visitors, because we don't have one in Washington. This area would never flood. It would be protected. And then at the request of GSA Administrator Dan Tangerlini some years ago, he asked if we could put in geothermal wells to provide clean energy for the government buildings surrounding the mall and the museums. So we added the geothermal wells. We had a public exhibit on Connecticut Avenue. And there's Arthur Moore on the left. He's the architect of design, me in the center, and Albert Small, a member of the coalition board as well, who donated the space for this exhibit. And this is where Dan Tangerlini of the General Services asked us to put in the geothermal. The Washington Post wrote an enthusiastic editorial back already in 2013. And in 2018, we took it to the Army Corps of Engineers and asked them to evaluate its role. They evaluated its stormwater potential, and they concluded that flood risk from a storm could be reduced significantly during a flood event by implementation of the underground. Now, it just so happens a couple days ago in the Washington Post, there's a big front page story about the Paris Olympics, which are coming this year, and how Paris is undergoing audacious plans to deal with flooding. And one thing that they're doing is building, as you can see in the lower right, a giant cistern under the city to collect exactly the problem we've got in Washington, the stormwater of overflowing sewers. But we've gone one more. We've actually came up with something that the Army Corps says the revenue potential from parking fees and water credits may offer self-financing opportunities that attract a public-private partnership. And in fact, the Army Corps told us this was a great appeal of this project. It not only required federal funding, but it required very little, if any, federal funding because of the revenue that would be coming in from the sale of irrigation water, stormwater credits, from parking revenue, and from clean energy credits. So we created something that created a huge hole in the middle of the mall for probably 18 months to maybe 2 years, but it would solve numerous problems: public use, parking, flood reservoir, and clean energy, all in one facility, and all able to use a public-private partnership idea. We presented to the Silver Jackets team, which is the federal and DC agencies who are supposed to be dealing with flooding problems, and they're all listed on the left there. At least 14 of them all came together, and Arthur presented the project, and they discussed it, but concluded that because the Park Service didn't like parking, that they would not agree to the underground. Instead, their preferred alternative is a pumping station at 15th and Constitution Avenue that would pump the stormwater, filthy as it is, directly from Constitution Avenue into the tidal basin. This is something we are not able to comprehend. We keep asking them, what does this mean? You're going to take the filthy water, we would put it in a cistern and then send it down to Blue Plains for treatment. They would pump it directly into the tidal basin. But the problem is, what if the tidal basin is flooding as well, which is very likely? The problem comes back to this again. Each agency has their own priorities, their own financing, and their own concerns. No one has authority to to plan for the entirety. And this is the quote the Washington Post took from me. There's nobody with the power and authority to rise above the divisions among these entities. So everyone just throws up their hands. This is the most urgent existential threat to our museums, our government treasures, and the symbolic place that represents who we are. And a couple days later, the Washington Post published this letter from Ed Steerley at the National Parks Conservation Association. It's time for Congress to establish a commission focused on addressing the climate resilience. Federal agencies must stop the finger pointing and prioritize saving the National Mall for future generations. And as a matter of fact, the National Parks Conservation Association contacted me. They're having a conference, a summit today with some of their members to talk about parks in Washington flooding, and also to talk about this Washington Post article and Ed's call for a commission. One of our members is attending, and I'll let you know how that comes out. We've offered an alternative because the Park Service doesn't like cars. Alternative A would be no cars. And Andrew Blair, the former president of Colonial Parking, who helped us design the parking component, proposed another alternative, alternative B. This could now become an electric vehicle charging station for the many government the government vehicles that will require it. Finally, goal: convince Congress or the president to convene a mall commission. The Washington Post has been supportive of our idea to grow the mall, about the need for a commission, and the concept of the underground. Post has been, especially under Fred Hyatt, who died a couple of years ago, tragically, young. But the Washington Post is well aware of the issues, and I think their flood story should be a wake-up call for many of us. So is the mall complete? Is it history? We hope not. It can't be, it shouldn't be, any more than American history is complete. We need to think in broad terms of how we want this place to represent us long into the future. Can we devise comprehensive solutions to mall needs. And that is our concept of the third century mall, a future. Thank you.